And good morning, everybody. I hope you had a splendid weekend. Today we'll be moving on with our look at mindfulness, and in fact, I think completing our look both at mindfulness and at this section on positive states of mind and being. We've been looking in the last lecture or two at the ways in which mindfulness affect people. We've looked at psychological effects, we've looked at physiological effects, and I want to continue in that vein by taking a look at one more study by Hurtzel and his colleagues done just about 8 years ago, in which they were looking at, again, cortical thickness. This was the last slide I think I showed you too, was a study on the thickness of the cortex, that thin layer of gray matter, nerve cells that covers the cerebrum, the surface of the brain. And they were looking at cortical thickness before and after mindfulness-based stress reduction training. That's what MBSR is. And they compared that with the usual waitlist controls, individuals who would then go through the MBSR program, but were waiting out the 8 weeks until the first group finished. And what they found was that there were a number of areas in the cortex of meditators that were thicker as a result, or after, let's say, after mindfulness-based stress reduction training than was true in the waitlist controls. Auditory areas, the somatosensory area, which is up at the just behind the central sulcus there, both of these were thicker, contained more cells, suggesting more processing of information from those senses was going on in the brains of individuals who had experienced MBSR training. And there were also differences in thickness in a number of other areas involved in learning, involved in memory, and so on and so forth. I've shown you just 2 studies looking at cortical thickness and differences in cortical thickness as a function of MBSR and other forms of meditation-based training. But there are a number of other studies like this, and they all show the same thing. And for our purposes, the important point about this is that it illustrates that a purely psychological process, things that, and something we can in fact choose to do ourselves, not something that is imposed on us by the circumstances on our life, but active choices that we make with respect to psychological functioning can affect the physiology and the physical structure of the nervous system. This is one of those wonderful discoveries of the last 25 or 30 years. When I was a young student, both as an undergraduate and as a beginning graduate student, the dogma in neurophysiology and physiological psychology at the time was that the brain was largely fixed and unchanging after about 5 or 6 years of age, maybe a little later than that. But the argument was that there were very few new neurons or other sorts of connections developed, if at any at all, after, let's say, puberty. And what the research, not just this research, but many, many, many other studies like them, have found is that, in fact, the brain is a very, very, very actively developing organ right through life, right through adulthood. And there are quite a number of brain areas that have been identified as producing brand new neurons, brand new brain cells after birth, right? And including, again, into adulthood. And this may be an illustration of exactly that point. That individuals who choose to undergo mindfulness-based stress reduction training experience a physical change in their brains as a consequence of that training. And that is a really remarkable outcome. As I think I mentioned, although I haven't really illustrated it in the lectures, a very, 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 very high proportion of the research on mindfulness comes from neuroscientists, comes from individuals who are primarily interested in the effects of that training and that experience on the physical brain and its functioning. And almost without exception, they find those changes. So again, I mean, apart from the specific relationship between mindfulness and brain changes, what again it illustrates is that things that we do, behaviors that we engage in, thought processes that we inculcate in ourselves can have physical consequences for the structure and functioning of the brain. And that is a remarkable thing, a very remarkable thing. Okay, and there were also differences in other areas. This would be mostly the parietal lobe that had to do with perspective taking and self-referential processes. Now, one of the things that we know about one area of the brain, the parietal lobe in particular, which is back here just before the occipital lobe at the back, the parietal lobe seems to be very much involved in our sense of self, our ideas of who we are, not just psychologically, but who we are physically. We know, for example, that when people experience phantom limbs, they've lost a arm or a leg to some accident or other, they often still feel as though that limb were present. That sensation seems to be mediated in large part by activity in the parietal lobe. There are also individuals, this is a little off topic, but it's interesting. There are individuals, and again, who seem to have parietal lobe problems, who do not recognize parts of their own body as belonging to them. They will quite literally take their leg and try to throw it out of bed because they think it's an alien object. It's not part of their body. So their physical sense of self is grossly disturbed, and it appears to be related to changes in activity in the parietal lobe area, where we see increases in thickness as a consequence of mindfulness-based stress reduction training. All right, any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. Now, again, this is a study that goes back about 10 or 11 years, and looking at, this time it's fMRI. They're not looking in this case at the physical structure of the brain. They're looking more at the activity of the brain. Functional MRI is particularly good at indicating which parts of the brain are busy when certain tasks are undertaken, which parts of the brain are getting more oxygen and so on, and therefore are showing higher levels of activity. And they were looking here at levels of activity comparing individuals who are either novice or intermediate loving kindness meditators, which is a form of meditation somewhat different from mindfulness, but not that different. And what they were doing was presenting, as these individuals were meditating, they were presenting the sounds of distress, voice sounds of distress, people in distress, and the sounds they make when that happens. And they were looking at the reaction, the physical brain reaction of individuals to those distress sounds as they were meditating. And what they found was that there was a higher reaction to those stress sounds in meditators than in non-meditators, right? Including the limbic system, which includes the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that's primarily responsible for the expression of especially negative emotions, fear, anxiety, and so on and so forth. And what they concluded from this was that one of the components of loving kindness meditation, of course, is empathy, concern for others. And their argument was essentially that what we're seeing here is the reflection of that increased empathy. There's a stronger reaction to the negative emotional experiences of others during meditation. Again, suggesting that empathy has been heightened by this experience. Right? All right, any questions or comments about that? Just a couple more. This is one of my favorites, the Callion study in 2014. It's about 6 years old now. And what they're looking at, so we've looked at psychological changes, we've looked at functional changes in the brain, the structure of the brain, activity of the brain. Now we're actually going to be looking at changes in the way the genes actually work as a function of mindfulness meditative training. So in this study, what they were looking at is looking at the expression of genes. How active are genes in producing various physical products, which is what most coding genes do, as a function of a meditative practice or by relaxation in the same environment. So they had individuals at this kind of day spa, I guess it would be called, and some of the individuals were meditating, undergoing a day of meditative practice, a meditative retreat, and the other people who were there for the same length of time were just enjoying themselves, relaxing, taking it easy, and so on and so forth. So they were controlling for the environment itself and for the passage of time. They had people in the same environment for the same amount of time, but one group was meditating, the other group was just relaxing, enjoying themselves, and so on and so forth. And they first of all looked at gene expression, how active genes were prior to the beginning of this manipulation, and they found no difference between the individuals who were subsequently going to be relaxing and the individuals who were subsequently going to be meditating. But after the day of meditation or relaxation, they did find differences. They found, first of all, that in the meditators, there was less activity in genes that control epigenetic processes. Now, epigenetic processes are those which control the activity level of genes. As you may know, epigenetic markers can be placed on genes or gene-promoting areas, and those markers essentially either shut down or activate the genes to which they're attached. So if you have a methylated gene area, essentially it says to the body, don't use this gene. Pretend this gene isn't here. Right? Turn it off. Right? And one of the kinds of genes that they were particularly looking at, and which seemed to be affected by epigenetic processes of those, are genes that promote products produced by inflammation. Inflammation is a process common in the immune system. We're all familiar with it. You get a cut on your knee, and one of the first things that happens is it swells up, it gets red, it gets warm. Those are the three signs of inflammation. Products of the immune system are rushing to that area to try and heal over the cut and make sure that no invading viruses or bacteria are getting in without being identified and destroyed. And so inflammation is a good thing in general, right? But the problem is that if it continues too long, or if it's too intense, or if it occurs in the wrong place, like the brain, it can be very damaging. It can cause physical damage to the brain itself. And one of the things that, one of the interesting areas of research in abnormal psychology, psychiatry, and so on, is the finding that a number of very common or well-known mental disorders are associated with high levels of pro-inflammatory activity in the immune system, as though the body, and sometimes it's autoimmune, so the body is turning on itself these otherwise desirable inflammatory processes and causing damage. And this is associated with a number of different mental disorders, right? Schizophrenia and a whole bunch of others. And so what we're seeing here is that meditation seems to reduce that process. Okay, anyway, so it looks as though these meditative practices are affecting body systems that, in fact, are implicated in good mental health and influencing them in a way that's suggestive of improvements in or lower levels of risk for mental disorder, right? Again, a very, very interesting finding. We've already seen that there's good evidence that meditative training improves response to anxiety and other sorts of fear-producing situations, right? Okay. Oh, yeah, I should ask first. Any questions or comments on any of this? Yeah. That there. Yeah, there's evidence that a number of different kinds of meditation produce changes in the brain. Some of them similar to these, others somewhat different. Absolutely, yeah. And again, it's a general illustration of the fact that mental activity that we choose to engage in can have a profound physical effect on our body and our brains in particular. No doubt about it. Right? I mean, we focused on mindfulness because that's the largest literature right now. But other forms do the same. Yoga does the same thing, for example, and other sorts of things. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right, now I want to show you just a couple of very, very much more recent studies, both 2019, that I came across relatively recently. And I think they're relatively late in 2019, too, so they're only a few months old. It's a study by Bauer, 2019. And here again, we're looking at younger individuals. We're looking at middle school children, so grades 6, 7, and 8, right? 12 or 13 years of age. And again, they're given either mindfulness training or training in computer coding for a period of time for 8 weeks. Of course, 8 weeks is the typical length of an MBSR training session. We've mentioned that already. And they measured stress. They measured the activity of the right amygdala, which of course is it's the non-dominant hemisphere, and the part of the brain responsible for emotional activity, particularly. And while they were viewing pictures indicating anger and aggressive intention. And what they found was that before training, viewing these fearful faces or angered faces produced higher levels of activity in the right amygdala, which you would expect. It's an activation of a negative emotion, right? So people were afraid, were disturbed in a negative way by viewing these pictures. But after training, the mindfulness group reports lower levels of stress, lower levels of amygdala activity to those very same set of faces, or to similar faces, right? Again, suggesting that, and we mentioned one of the functions of meditation was desensitization, was reducing our negative reaction to things which bother us, right? This, in fact, of course, that general idea of reducing negative reactivity to something through repeated exposure is a standard treatment in clinical psychology. It's called exposure therapy. If you're afraid of, for example, if you have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and your concern is you're a germaphobe, you're desperately afraid of catching some terrible disease if your hands get dirty. So you end up washing your hands 40 times a day. If the slightest little thing gets on them, you immediately have to wash them. And where was I going with this? Oh, and so one of the ways of dealing with this in therapy is to have the individual immerse their hands in dirt and just sit there with dirty hands for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Nothing happens, of course, nothing bad happens at all, and so the argument is that eventually the individual will cease to fear these contamination scenarios and their stress level will go down. So it looks as though this meditative training is accomplishing very much the same thing. It is desensitizing individuals to stimuli which would otherwise be disturbing and upsetting to them. Makes them calmer, gives them a higher level of equanimity, which of course, as we saw, is one of the Buddhist virtues. Right? Okay. Oh, and then there's another very, very, very interesting finding here. They found a lot of higher connections between the right amygdala and the prefrontal cortex while they're viewing these faces. Now, the important thing here, the significance of this, is that we believe that the whole prefrontal cortex is largely an area which is responsible for modulating, calibrating our response to things. It essentially says, okay, don't worry too much about this, calm down, you're going to be okay, we can relax, and therefore it tones down the activity of other more primitive parts of the brain, like the amygdala and the basal ganglia, which we will talk about. And so it looks like what's happening here is we're getting stronger upper brain control over lower brain processes as a result of meditative training. And that, as far as anyone can tell, can only be a good thing, right? It allows us to make better, finer discriminations between situations in which we should show intense emotion and situations where that emotion is inappropriate or outdone in some way. And that seems to be happening here as a function of mindfulness meditative practice. Okay, any questions here, by the way, comments? Okay. And another 2019 study. This, again, we're looking at young people, grades 5 to 8. And what they're not training them in mindfulness. What they're doing is using a standardized test to assess the degree to which these individuals already show characteristics of mindfulness, attentiveness to the present, and so on and so forth, right? So they're looking at the relationship between mindfulness and various aspects of academic performance. And what they find is that individuals who are higher in mindfulness are better students, as a matter of fact. They have higher GPAs, they show higher standardized test scores, greater improvement from year to year in their performance, and a number of things, better attendance, fewer suspensions. Just about everything about them seems better. Now, the problem here, of course, is this is a purely correlational study. This is not an experimental manipulation in which these children underwent or did not mindfulness training, and then we looked at what the consequences were. This is simply a study which looks at individuals as they currently are in terms of their degree of mindfulness practice, right? They may and probably don't know anything about mindfulness. Is this simply part of their mental setup? And to the degree that it is, it seems to be associated fairly strongly and certainly significantly with better academic performance, right? So the big question here, and of course, as I said, this is a very recent study, so they haven't tried this yet. Could you take individuals who were underperforming in middle school, for example, give them mindfulness-based stress reduction training or something like that, mindfulness training, and would it therefore improve these outcomes for those students as well? Is this another psychological manipulation that would have significant life consequences for the individuals who experienced it? We don't know that yet. There is some indication in a very few, very small pilot studies. I think, in fact, the Catholic School Board here in Hamilton has done or did some mindfulness-based exercises with at least some subset of students, and the results were promising, although I don't think they published any of the results. I've talked to one of the teachers who was involved in this. But I think we're going to be seeing more of this. We're certainly seeing many, many more applications of mindfulness to a wide range of things, certainly to psychotherapy. It's been, as I indicated, it's been adopted as a form of or an adjunct to or a part of psychotherapy by a number of individuals who work with patients or clients to improve their lives. We talked about dialectical behavior theory. We talked about acceptance and commitment therapy. All of those things all involve components of mindfulness and seem to be effective in what they do. Okay. Now, just a couple more quick examples, because again, the problem I face in this area is the size of the literature. On the one hand, I mean, you could do it without any citations of the literature at all and simply say, these are things that people have found. But I always like to illustrate or document, if you like, the changes that I mention here by referring to studies that have shown these changes. But again, there are lots and lots of these studies, and I'm just picking, not quite at random, but picking just a few to illustrate the sorts of changes that people have reported in a number of other studies, in addition to the one I mentioned. Here's a study example, for example, in 2003, 16 years old, an old study by the standards of the literature, in which they found that the processing of attentional and emotional information was better in experienced meditators than in those who were just starting out. A study done in 2010, again looking at waitlist controls versus meditators, found that meditation improved sustained attention and visual discrimination. Now, what's interesting about that particular finding, to me at least, is that those two things, sustained attention and visual discrimination, happen to be problems in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And I wonder, and there are some studies suggesting that applying these sorts of techniques to individuals with, say, ADHD or autism does improve their symptomatology. And this looks like it targets very specifically the sorts of symptoms that are thought to be at the heart of ADHD issues. So I think we're going to be seeing more of this applied to pediatric and other early life mental disorder categories in future. As I said, it's a very growing literature. Now, another very, very, very common application of mindfulness training is to people in the healthcare sector. Of course, the introduction of mindfulness to Western medical and psychological practice really began in, as I mentioned, 1979, with the opening of the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so because a lot of nurses and doctors, in addition to patients, came in contact with that process, with that program, it has been applied quite widely to a number of healthcare workers. And one group to which it's been very regularly applied is nurses. And one of the main reasons, well, in general, in the healthcare sector, there's a very high burnout rate. It's a stressful job. People often leave their position, change careers, and so on because they simply cannot handle the day-to-day stress of a medical career. And all these little bells which drive them completely crazy. That's a second code red in the parking garage in the last half hour. What the hell is going on down there? Anyway, all right. And in particular, among healthcare workers, nurses seem to be about the most stressed of all. An extraordinarily important career, as you can imagine. I've known a number of nurses over my lifetime. But it's very, very demanding. Lots of physical activity, lots of risks, lots of work. And there's a very high level of stress in the nursing occupation. And so one of the places that meditation of various sorts has been tried is with nurses, and here's a study like that. Nursing students, again, undertaking the 8-week MBSR clinic and found that it reduced their level of stress and increased their empathy for patients, better still. And here's a quotation. Participants reported using meditation in daily life and experiencing greater well-being and improved coping skills as a result of the program. Now, this, of course, is self-report. We can't be sure objectively that that's actually true of these individuals, but that's how they see the changes that have been made in their life through the use of meditative practice. And one more. Again, healthcare professionals reported improved life satisfaction, self-compassion, and reduced stress after, again, the 8-week MBSR. Now, self-compassion is a very important idea. We don't come across it that often. We talk about, for example, the importance of, and we will later in the course, talk about the importance of forgiveness and other sorts of reactions to the sins, if you like, of others. But it's equally important, of course, to forgive and accept ourselves. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemy, setting standards that we can't meet, and we are angry at ourselves for not meeting them, and so on and so on and so forth. And so an improvement in self-compassion is a very, very important change in an individual's outlook on life. You need to forgive yourself. You need to give yourself permission to do X or whatever the phraseology is. And meditation seems to help in that. It improves empathy not only for others, but also for oneself. Okay? All right, any questions or comments about any of that? Now, I just want to throw this up here because I ran across it a couple of years ago. As I said, mindfulness meditation is showing up absolutely everywhere. Companies are regularly instituting MBSR-like programs for their workers and so on and so forth. It's taught here on campus. There are mindfulness programs that typically run, I think, twice, or they used to run twice a year, beginning both in the fall and in the winter term. I don't know, I haven't kept track to see where that's... Okay, well, that's good news. All right. Anyway, so as I said, the use of mindfulness has spread all over the place. I mean, it's growing. And so I was particularly bemused to come across this particular article about how professional football teams in the National Football League are using mindfulness-based training in the hopes of improving the performance of their athletes in that sport as well. Okay. Now, as I said, mindfulness can be applied as a treatment. It's employed as part of a psychotherapy program. I mentioned the MBT, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy for personality disorders, borderline personality disorder in particular. But it's also been applied directly as part of the treatment for specific mental disorders. In this case, it's a study done in 2006 looking at children on the autism spectrum, a disorder which today is called autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Anyway, so what they did, and this is another caregiver stress situation. Dealing with an autistic child can be extremely challenging. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but they behave in a number of ways and express emotion in a number of ways that are very hard for those around them often to deal with. And so it's an extraordinarily stressful job, if you like, to be the parent of an autistic child. You'll spend 18, 20 years with this child, dealing and coping every single day with the issues they face and the problems that they are having. And so what they did in this particular case was they gave parents of children with autism a lengthened, longer than usual mindfulness training regimen, 12 weeks instead of the usual 8, right? And then followed them and the kids for a number of months. Whoops. And one of the first things that's fascinating about this is that the treatment, of course, goes to the parents. The outcome is improvement in the child's behavior, right? So we get decreased aggression, decreased levels of non-compliance, decreased levels of self-injury. This is very, very significant. One of the unfortunate symptoms of individuals somewhere down farther on the autism spectrum is they harm themselves. They will bang their heads against the wall until they bleed, and in some cases until they fracture their own skulls. And it's an extraordinary problem, as you can imagine, right? How do you deal with this? How do you handle this? There are very few really good ways of doing this. But so the finding that self-injury decreases in the children of parents who have undergone mindfulness training is a very, very significant finding, right? So it's obvious that what's happening here somehow, and they don't really explicate exactly how it happens, is the parents are responding differently to their own children. And that response to the children, in turn, is affecting the way the kids respond and the kids behave. Now, we talked about this reciprocity when we talked about Bandura and Michel in personality, didn't we? Right? Reciprocal interactionism, where you affect the environment and the environment, in fact, affects you. And that seems to be happening right here in the case of these autistic kids. Now, it also, of course, had an impact on the parents. They expressed higher levels of interest in, involvement in, and satisfaction with their parenting, and higher levels of positive interaction with their children when you ask the mothers, at least, who are typically the primary caretakers here, right? So a very important finding as well. We move on to ADHD, the disorder I mentioned earlier, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And again, 8 weeks of MBSR. Now, these are two individuals who actually have ADHD, not to the parents, as was the case with the autism spectrum disorder. So 8 weeks, the typical length of MBSR training for these adults and adolescents who have ADHD. And what do they say? Well, again, self-report always, and they report fewer symptoms. They report improved attention, and all sorts of things associated with their disorder seem to get better, right? As a consequence or following this 8 weeks of mindfulness-based meditative training. Lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depressive symptoms, and so on and so forth. All of these things tend to come together with ADHD and autism, anxiety, depression, and so on. So again, it has it seems to have a lot of promise for dealing with, I mean, it may not be the only, it's certainly not the only, it may not always be the best way to deal with these symptoms, but it does seem to produce a positive impact. And again, it's a low-risk intervention. I mean, every time you give a child or an adult medication, they always, almost without exception, they come along with side effects that are undesirable. All you have to do is listen to the drug ads on television, and you know that, right? They'll talk about how wonderful drug X is for this, that, and the other thing. Then they'll spend half a minute talking about the terrible things that are going to happen to you if you take this drug, right? Well, of course, with mindfulness meditative practice, that's not true. Nobody overdoses on mindfulness. Nobody has a bad mindfulness trip. I mean, it's something you do. It's an activity you engage in, and it's never experienced as a negative, and it has no side effects. And you don't have to keep, well, you can keep doing it all your life, but it's unlike medication, which costs you every time you take a dosage. This stuff is free. So again, we're going to see, I predict, more and more applications of mindfulness practice into a wider and wider range of psychological issues, including now, as I've said, and as we've seen, including actual diagnosable cases of mental disorder, right, where it also seems to help. Okay. All right, any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. Now, in personality, when we talked about Carl Rogers, we did for the first and only time, we talked about his methods of therapy, right? We talked about his idea that the therapeutic, that any relationship whatsoever could have a therapeutic effect on a client, on a person, if it met a number of criteria. The individuals had to be in each other's phenomenal fields. The client had to be, the therapist had to be dispensing unconditional positive regard, and so on and so forth, right? And so a lot of that, of course, is echoed in the mindfulness literature, isn't it? And here's a quotation, I forget, Hickenbein, who say this about the role of mindfulness meditative practice as a therapist. Within the client-therapist relationship, mindfulness is a way of paying attention with empathy, presence, and deep listening that can be cultivated, sustained, and integrated into our work as therapists through the ongoing discipline of meditation practice. Mindfulness places the therapist directly in the here and now encounter with the client. It is a non-judgmental, moment-to-moment awareness. And if that's not a perfect description of unconditional self-positive regard, I don't know what is. It could have been drawn right out of Rogers' own writings, right? But what they're saying is one way to get to this state that Rogers believes, and many others, believe to be so important in the therapeutic effect of relationships is through our own mindfulness meditative practice, right? Okay, any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. And speaking of relationships, there have been a number of studies over the years looking at the effect on the members of partners in a relationship, typically marital relationships or long-term romantic relationships, the effect on those relationships of mindfulness meditative practice by either one or both partners to the relationship. Here's a study done, again, about 16 years ago, Carson et al., and looking at meditators versus weightless controls. And they were asking them about their relationships and how they were going, and compared the answers from weightless controllers versus active meditators. Meditators reported greater closeness to their partners, greater acceptance of each other, higher levels of self-perceived autonomy, self-directedness, and higher levels of relationship satisfaction. And a study done just a few years later replicated all of that, right? And went on to ask the question, so why does this happen? Why does mindfulness meditative practice have this impact on relationships, on partners in a committed relationship? And they identified at least one factor, there might be several. They identified at least one factor they argued was very heavily responsible for this change, this improvement, and that was an increased degree of communication, open communication between the partners in the couple. And that led to the greater satisfaction and so on and so on and so forth. And as I said, there are a number of other studies that find much the same sorts of things, looking at meditation and relationship satisfaction and success and so on and so forth. We'll come across a couple of studies like this, related to this, when we look at gratitude later on in the course. Okay. I want to end today with a reminder that Sunday, in addition to being Super Bowl Sunday, for you sports fans, is also Groundhog Day. Right? And I want to recommend to you a movie which I hope that some of you have seen. How many of you have seen the movie Groundhog Day? Excellent, but more of you need to see it. It shows every single Groundhog Day, and I think CTV is running it. It would be Channel 3 for Kojiko users. This on the afternoon of this Sunday. And it's an extraordinary movie. It's considered one of the best movies of the last 50 years, and I would certainly agree with that. I mention it here because when it was first released, it was well received, but not a blockbuster. But it has grown and grown and grown and grown in popularity over the years to become a much, much, much more popular movie, just like It's a Wonderful Life, Capra's 1948 movie. Anyway, and what's interesting about it is that individuals from a number of different religious traditions have adopted this movie as an illustration of the sorts of virtues that their religious beliefs lead them to believe are important. And you certainly see that from a Buddhist perspective. The Buddhists have also pointed to this as an indicator. Let me just outline the plot for you, for those of you who haven't seen it, or a reminder for those of you who hadn't seen it in a long time. It's the story of a small-time weatherman on a TV station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, played by Bill Murray there on the left. He has a producer, I forget what her name is in the movie, played by Andy McDowell there in the center. And the movie opens on February the 1st. He's giving his last forecast of the day and saying, well, there's a storm moving in, but it won't hit us. And then he says, well, and tomorrow I'll be off in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, to watch Punxsutawney Phil, the weather forecasting groundhog, tell us whether we're going to have 6 more weeks of winter. And he and his crew, his cameraman and his producer there, pack up and drive off to Punxsutawney, a place that Phil loathes. He hates the place. It's a small hick town as far as he's concerned. And Phil is not a really nice person at the start of the movie. He's a self-centered, egotistical guy out for whatever he can get from life. I mean, he's a very definitely a hedonistic kind of guy, right? And nobody likes him very much, really. Anyway, so they get out there on the evening of February 1st. He signs in at his bread and breakfast and wakes up the next morning to the song, I've Got You, Babe, Sonny and Cher on the radio. And he then goes through the day, goes to the hill where Punxsutawney Phil is, delivers a very brief video story, which can be played on the news, and then gets ready. They have lunch at a cafeteria, and they're about to head home. And Phil can hardly wait to get back to Pittsburgh, because, Punxsutawney, Jesus, nothing there. Anyway, but the storm moves in. The storm that he forecast would miss the area comes in, and they're stuck in Punxsutawney for the night. So he wakes up the next morning, again, hearing the song, I've Got You, Babe, by Sonny and Cher on the radio, and the day before plays over again. Exactly the same things happen. Everybody says it's February the 2nd. It's Groundhog Day, just as it was the day before. He once again goes through the whole thing thinking it's just been a bad dream, goes to sleep, but wakes up again to find that it's February the 2nd for the 3rd day in a row. And after a few days of this, right, as he gets increasingly frustrated, he realizes that this can be a real boon. He understands that no matter what he does, he will wake up the next day and start over again on February the 2nd. So he steals some money, he starts eating crappy food, he drinks too much, he does all kinds of self-negating and self-destroying sorts of things, but also in a very selfish way. He doesn't care about anybody else, right? And this goes on for some time, but eventually he becomes very disheartened by this whole thing, day after day after day after day, hundreds of February the 2nd, every time the same thing. And he finally decides to end the whole thing by committing suicide, which he tries in half a dozen different ways. He jumps off a building, he sits on a railway track, he drives off a cliff with Punxsutawney Phil, and every single time he wakes up the next morning and it's February the 2nd again. So eventually he gives in. He decides, rather than trying to do everything for myself, maybe I should use these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of days to better myself. And so he learns to play the piano, he learns ice sculpting, he learns a couple of languages. I mean, he does all kinds of things. And he starts paying more attention to the people around him. He discovers that bad things happen on February the 2nd. A kid falls out of a tree, the old ladies have their car tire go flat, and so on and so forth. And as he discovers that the same things happen every day at the same time, he makes sure he's right there to catch the kid who falls from the tree, to change the tire for the ladies in the car, and so on and so forth. He becomes beloved of the entire community. And the important thing is he's given up, he's stopped grasping. He stopped wanting. And this is the Buddhist message at the center of this, right? He no longer is attached to things. He has gone out and he's begun to be someone who cares about others. He's gone from the hedonistic approach to the good life to the eudaimonic approach. Live the life of virtue and caring and empathy, right? And he's also got this thing, as I said, for his producer. He tries to get into his bed a number of times, can't succeed. Finally, when he stops trying, when he just is himself and demonstrates the good side of himself, he wins her at the end, and he wakes up on February the 3rd. And they decide to live in Punxsutawney, right? This town that he loathed, but has now come to love. It's a beautiful little story. And a very funny movie. And I highly recommend it if you get a chance to see it this weekend, or any other time for that matter, take that opportunity. All right, my friends, next time we will start our next topic. Now, let me say that the content of our first midterm ends right here. Nothing beyond this will appear on the first midterm, and we'll begin looking at positive emotions and happiness next time. We'll see you then. Take care.